One of the most important economic indicators is the unemployment rate. It's easy to see why. If people don't have jobs, they're not making money, which means they're probably not consuming as much. That will drive down GDP and slow down economic growth. As a result, it's pretty important to keep track of the unemployment rate. And to do that, we need to understand how to measure that unemployment rate. To measure the unemployment rate, we need to understand three terms. The first is the civilian non-institutional population. That's the big orange circle here on this slide. The civilian non-institutional population is everyone in the United States who's at least 16 years old and is not incarcerated. You can think of this as the total number of people who could potentially have a job. The next term is the labor force. That's that dark gray circle. The labor force is a subset of the civilian non-institutional population, defined by the number of people who have jobs, plus the number of people who are unemployed. Now, how does that total differ from the civilian population? It differs because of how we define unemployed. So, unemployed workers both don't have jobs, but they also have made specific efforts to find a job during the past month. Once we've defined our terms this way, the unemployment rate is straightforward. It's defined as the number of unemployed people divided by the total labor force. As we think about this definition of unemployment rate, it's important to consider who's left out. By defining unemployed this way, we're excluding anyone who doesn't have a job but also hasn't tried to find a job in the last month. Some of those individuals, it might make sense not to call unemployed. If you're a full-time student not trying to find work, it might make sense to not have you be part of the labor force. In contrast, if you're someone who's been unemployed for a long time and you haven't looked for a job because you've been unsuccessful finding a job for the past year and you've given up, it might be a problem to exclude you from the labor force. That's an individual who really would like to be working right now and has just dropped out because it seems impossible. We should be aware that these individuals are not in our unemployment rate, and as a result, our unemployment rate might look too low relative to the truth. All right, with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the data. To find unemployment rate in Fred, we use the code UNRATE. Let's go ahead and jump to Fred and look at the data. We can see, as we pull up the unemployment rate here in Fred, a very clear pattern. Every time there's a recession, represented by those gray bars on the graph, the unemployment rate spikes. This is intuitive. During recessions, people lose their jobs, and that's reflected there in the data. And in fact, one way of measuring how severe a recession is to ask how much did the unemployment rate increase during that recessionary period. Well, the other clear pattern here is following recessions, the unemployment rate tends to fall. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but the pattern there is very clear. Okay, well, that unemployment rate, though, if it's too low, might be a little bit misleading. So what about those discouraged workers? If we go back to our diagram here, those discouraged workers, they're not working, but they're also not looking for work because they're discouraged. And so rather than showing up in the unemployed category, they're just left here in the orange circle, part of the civilian non-institutional population that is not in the labor force. What does that do to our unemployment rate? Well, as we mentioned earlier, it makes our measured unemployment rate look too low. Importantly, we can define other measures of unemployment that account for these discouraged workers. And so, in fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines 6 different measures of unemployment. The main reported measure is U3, which is defined how we just did a second ago, the total number of unemployed divided by the labor force. However, we can also focus on U4. U4 takes the total number of unemployed and adds back in those discouraged workers, those workers who would like to be working but have stopped looking for a job because they just don't believe they're able to find one. We add in those discouraged workers both to the unemployed and to the labor force and then recalculate the unemployment rate. And as a result, we can see what happens when we add those. And there are a number of other measures of unemployment here, ranging from U1, where to be unemployed we define very strict definitions where you have to be unemployed for a very long time before we call you unemployed. So that gets rid of short-term spells of unemployment. All the way to U6, which is a very broad definition of unemployment, where it's not only adding in discouraged workers, but also adding in workers, for example, who are working part-time but wish they could be working full-time. And so we go from a very strict definition of unemployment to a very broad definition of unemployment. For our purposes, we'll focus mostly on U3, which is the headline rate, and U4, which includes those discouraged workers. So if we add in discouraged workers and look at the data in Fred, this is what we see. The headline unemployment rate, which we looked at earlier, is in red. The unemployment rate, including the discouraged workers, is in blue. And you can see that blue rate is always higher than the red rate. But the differences are not usually that big. And so on average, unemployment driven by discouraged workers is not a huge problem in the United States. But of course it could be at any given point of time, and so it is a useful piece of data to pay attention to.